I have a few little stories I'd like to share because that's what I do. I'll start with one that might sound very familiar and feel very recent. And that's a story about the run-up to a very controversial and tough election night. And really, for me, my first memories of that night that I thought, oh, we're in trouble, came several weeks earlier when I started seeing some finger pointing to different communities. Oh, it's going to be the black vote. We're losing the black vote. Oh, no, it's the Latinos. We're losing the Latinos. Or finger pointing that came from within towards leadership. Oh, it's too white. It's too male. And just watching us divide, and people get more and more nervous. And when the election turned out poorly for us, the finger pointing and the blame game and the Monday morning quarterbacking just got worse and worse. And I'm not talking about this past election, because this has happened far too often in our movement. I'm talking about 2008 and the election over Proposition 8 in California that, if you don't recall, was born here and funded from here, but meant to take away the right for gay and lesbian people who had that right in California to marry. And we lost. And the blame game was vicious. And honestly, some of the blame was well placed. And I wondered, because I was in this very unique position at the time, that I had just spent the past 6 years researching a man named Harvey Milk, who 30 years earlier than that had won a statewide ballot initiative in California to kick out all gay and lesbian teachers in California. When that one was polling, he should have lost. It was initially polling 80% in favor of getting rid of gay teachers, and he had won. What happened? What was different? And at that time, I was also researching a movie that finally came out last year on Bayard Rustin, who, as a gay black man, had built the March on Washington. And I was looking at, how did he succeed when so many were failing? How did he put together a coalition? You know, and I looked to Harvey, and I just did my homework. I said, well, what did Harvey do? How did he get elected? Well, he didn't get elected just by going to all the gay men and saying, hey, vote for me, let's get really enthusiastic, and just to the people he knew would agree with him. No, he went to the unions, to the workers, and said, you're not being paid a living wage to drive these Coors beer trucks. How do you pay for your kids, their food, the roof over your head? And they said, we can't. He said, well, guess what? Us gays, we drink a lot of Coors. But we're going to stop. We are going to stop drinking Coors. We're going to make them into the pariah of all beer until they cave and start paying you a living wage. And gay people did protest Coors, did boycott Coors. And the unions caved and started paying a living wage. He then went to Chinatown in San Francisco and said, how about we get those ballots in Mandarin so we can get your voting participation up so you can start to have a voice in this city of yours? He reached out and said, what can we as a community do for you, and build bridges over political divides. Bayard Rustin in building the March in Washington, what did he call it? A march for jobs and freedom. And the symbol he used in that March on Washington, where Martin Luther King said, I have a dream, was a black hand and a white hand clasping. Harvey Milk and Bayard Rustin and so many others in times of great success understood that a civil rights movement only succeeds when its focus is addition, not subtraction, not division. They understood that, yes, it's impossibly hard to be a minority and sometimes can be deadly and dangerous, and that the work you do to investigate your differences is critical. Dig deep into what they are, how you're being treated differently and unfairly by a system. Sure, do it. Share those stories to create understanding and empathy. But never think that the game is to prove that you've got it worse. This is not the discrimination Olympics, people. You do not win a prize for proving that you have it harder than someone else. You win the prize when you feel like a victim, but you do not allow yourself to be labeled a victim or victimized. You have the courage to lock arms with people who you know don't agree with you on everything, and to build a coalition. I have to say, I was so impressed and hopeful by the panel I saw up here. You know, we had a Republican, an unaffiliated candidate, and a Democrat. And sadly, I was a little bothered, I'm not gonna lie, by a little bit of the booing or hissing, a little bit of the texting I saw and the tweeting I saw around our Republican elected official here. And I thought about my son, because now I'm a dad. And I thought about what it is we do when we have kids, because all of a sudden you start to want to protect them. You're the protector. And I thought about, we have a lot of homeless in Los Angeles right now. I'm sure it's everywhere post-pandemic. And I can see how people will carve a path away when you're passing on the street. And I tried my very best with my son to not do that, to stay close. And if friendly, ask a question. We had someone sleeping in front of our house, and I said, well, why don't we offer him water? Instead of just saying, get lost. Ask where he's from. That became very challenging when 2.5 months ago, my family was violently attacked by a homeless person. And when the person threw an object through a glass window at my 6-year-old, and his arm was bleeding, and I saw the terror in his eyes, and talked to him about that terror day after day, I thought, my job is to not let him become afraid of all people who look like that. And it's hard, because as a parent, you just want to hold them close and keep them safe. But my job was to keep walking down that same block, walking past that same restaurant, still talking to the homeless folks who aren't going to throw something at him. To get him brave again in the face of something that might be scary because it's different. Well, people, I'll tell you what we did with Proposition 8. And some of you know this. And we had to put some of this "don't be afraid of others" to good effect. Once we lost Proposition 8, I heard all of that infighting. I saw how people were pointing fingers, and I thought, how do we rebuild that coalition? And together with Chad Griffin and Rob Reiner and some Hollywood types, we said, well, we got to do the hard work. And we built the American Foundation for Equal Rights. And kind of following along in the tradition of Troy Williams and Equality Utah here, we said, we cannot make this issue a partisan issue. If we make our lives, our freedom, our equality, the protection of who we are as people who are very different in this country, a partisan issue, then it will never be secure. So we said to ourselves, this can't just be a Democratic thing. We're going to file a Supreme Court case to say that Proposition 8 is unconstitutional. But if we only make the progressive argument for that, if we only go and get David Boies, the most celebrated, Supreme Court lawyer on the left, to advocate for us, even if we went to the Supreme Court, we will lose eventually. It'll be taken away. And we did something that got us in a hell of a lot of good trouble. We went to Ted Olson, the most celebrated conservative lawyer, to argue before the Supreme Court. And we said, would you come in here with your very different perspective and teach us what the conservative case for our kind is? I don't speak that language. Many of you in here do not speak that language, but Anthony does. Some of those people struggling at BYU do, even professors. It is time we go to you, Anthony, and we say, it's not just grateful because you do as we hope you would do. We're also grateful because maybe you can teach us how to speak your language on our causes. Teach us. We think differently. We probably have different opinions on different issues. So did I and Ted Olson. I'm sitting in cars driving around Ted Olson. I'm like, you're the guy who gave us George W. Bush at the Supreme Court. How are we sitting together? But we saw our common humanity, and we knew we had so much to learn from one another. And then we took that strategy and we said, well, then we can't just keep preaching to the choir. In California, we had to take the show on the road and take this as an opportunity to go to the South and to speak where? In churches, using what Ted taught us and published on the cover of a giant national magazine, The Conservative Case for Gay Marriage. Having talkbacks face-to-face with people who we knew disagreed with us on almost everything. And do you know what that did over those few years it took from filing the Supreme Court case to getting to the Supreme Court for arguments? We moved the numbers from one where most of the nation was against marriage equality to where every state in the union was in favor. But we didn't do that by just making the progressive case. We did that by learning to speak the language of folks on the other side. I gotta tell you, it is so critically important in this dark moment to listen. And listen before you start to speak. Listen when it's really difficult. Try to understand a point of view that might be against you. Understand it, take it in. And if you have the opportunity to show the courage to actually share space with that person instead of just tweeting against them, do it. You know, I was really shocked. Yesterday, was that just yesterday morning? And pleasantly surprised when I went to the Capitol building and I'm sitting there sort of in that bottom level under the rotunda and I see someone walk by who, in my experience, was the enemy. I saw her face and I went, oh my God, she's the person who rallied against my show Big Love, who got signatures going, who's preached out against a lot of what I do. And I said, what's gonna happen right now? Because here she comes. And Troy Williams puts his arm around her and says, Lance, I'd like you to meet Gail Rosica. Head of the, Eagle Forum, I was like, oh my goodness, here we are together. And then I watched them talk to each other, share space with each other, compliment each other, blush at the other's compliments. And it was very clear that they have more in common than they have that separates them. And that's wild. Gail Rosica and Troy Williams. But frankly, that's the work that has to be done. And I want to say a couple things about how I hope Utah can continue to set an example. And I'm preaching to the choir here because you're already doing it. But my mother said to me, and I try to pass this on to my kids, as a kid, when I was trying to get something, she said, you need to make a decision in your life. Do you want to be right, or do you want to get what you want? And I thought, well, I want to be right. And she says, well, then you're probably not going to get what you want. Being right might feel really good to you for a while, but that other person thinks they're pretty right as well. Figure out what it is you want and put aside the purity tests of others to see if they're right in the way that you're right. And right now, across this country, when someone doesn't agree with us 100%, and this is an accusation against our movement. When someone doesn't feel the exact same way as every issue in our movement and beyond, we tend to reject them. We say, you're not progressive enough on this issue. You're not progressive enough on that issue. I don't agree with how you voted, for president, even if you have an equality stance. And we start to do the worst thing possible in politics. We set in on the politics of subtraction, which will lead us right back to where we are now, right back to where we were in 2008. Being able to share space with Gail Rosica is an example of someone and a movement that can see beyond difference and start to see the commonality, the common good. And that might sound touchy-feely. No, babies, that's existential. This is about survival. If we continue to eliminate potential allies with our purity tests, you will find yourself completely alone and isolated. Your rights will be removed and you might be exterminated. And if you think I'm exaggerating, do some reading on 1920s Berlin. Enough of the purity tests. Enough about being right. What we want is equality. in all matters governed by civil law in all 435 congressional districts in the United States of America for LGBTQ people. And in order to do that, we're going to have to put up with the opinions of some people that piss us off and make friends and lock arms. And when my husband and my agents and everybody say, why are you going to Utah again? I think Utah is uniquely positioned. And this is looking at the results of the last election. This is also just being on the ground and seeing how people are here. And the necessity to have understanding, to find that commonality in the Venn diagram, not what's different. It comes from the ability of this state, when it makes progress, to shock the nation. And so I come here because it's a call to action to do what you've been doing for so many years now. I need this state to have a big win. And in winning, I need it to set an example. The country needs it to set an example of how that win is achieved. And it's achieved by that kind of multipartisanship. It's achieved by, even when you want to point a finger, build a bridge. Ask them out to lunch. Have a drink. Look people eye to eye. It's going to be won by coalition building. And when you shock the nation again with a headline that equality has won in the state of Utah, I want you to stand proud and say, this is how it's done. It's done with the courage to lock arms and to love thy neighbor even when they're a Republican. Because when that moment happens, and I'll tell you, I've been having these conversations with a lot of leaders and elected leaders in this country, and they are lost. And they need an example of how to lead again, of how to win again, of how to build coalitions again. And you, Utah, are uniquely positioned to do that. Please do that. Win again. Win again. And let us take that example to the nation. Thank you so very much.